the most difficult part to grasp about this. So do you guys have any questions in general about what we talked about on Friday, or about the Al-Channel effect specifically? It's kind of counterintuitive at first because you see like they're both getting more expensive, so you think people are going to buy less of the more expensive good. But because of opportunity cost, it ends up being relatively cheaper to buy the more expensive good. You have to give up less of the low cost, low quality good.
We get two words.
Yeah, you can do it again. Yeah.
Hey, welcome to class, guys.
All right, so now let's move on to shifts in the demand curve. So if there's a change in price, we're looking at, let's say, this demand curve D1. Normal situation, if there's just a change in price, you're going to move along this. But if there's something other than price that's going to affect demand, that's going to end up shifting the demand curve. So we'll go to the left or to the right. We move out here to the right, that's going to be an increase in demand. So at each different price point, you're going to, like, consumers will demand more of that product. Conversely, if you shift the curve to the left, that's going to be a decrease in demand. So at every single price point, there's going to be fewer of that product being demanded by consumers. Yeah. So then at every single price point, the quantity demanded is going to change when we experience a shift in the demand curve. And that's either an increase in demand or a decrease in demand. So if we look at here at P1, the initial price, if we shift the demand curve to the right, we increase demand, we're going to move from Q1 to Q2. So there's going to be more demanded at that price. So even if the price doesn't change in this situation, because the curve shifted out, we're going to see a higher quantity demand. And it's the exact opposite for a decrease in demand. We'll shift the curve to the left. And at that same price, we're going to move from Q1 to Q3. So what are some of the factors that influence market demand? Obviously, there's more than just these, but these are the main ones that we'll be talking about. The first is income. Next is the price of related goods, so goods that you're going to buy with that particular good we're looking at. The tastes and preferences of consumers. Population and demographics, so the number of consumers you can possibly have. And the expected future prices. So we'll talk about these individually. So the first is the change in income of consumers. So obviously your budget is going to impact how much you're willing and able to purchase. So if your income increases, you're going to be willing to buy more because you have more money on hand. So there's two types of goods we need to talk about when there's changes in income. The first are normal goods. It's called that because that's pretty much every good out there. So your demand for a normal good is going to increase as your income increases. And if your income falls, you're going to demand less of that good because again, you have less money to spend. So examples are like clothing, restaurant meals, vacations, pretty much most things that you're going to want to buy. Now there's also what's called inferior goods. And for inferior goods, your demand is going to increase as your income goes down. And your demand is going to decrease as your income rises. So these are things like secondhand clothing, ramen noodles, really cheap goods that you only buy because you don't have much money. So you graduate college and you get a good job, you start making a lot of money, the amount of clothing you're going to buy will increase in general. Or maybe you'll buy more expensive clothing. But the amount of secondhand clothing you're going to buy is going to decrease. Once you start making that money, you don't have to buy secondhand clothing anymore. So the amount of secondhand clothing you're going to buy will decrease. Likewise with ramen noodles, you don't see rich people eating a ton of ramen noodles. You see them going out to restaurants a lot more. So for an individual, An increase in their income is going to increase their demand for a normal good like clothing, all things being equal. However, the same increase in income is going to decrease the demand for secondhand clothing, the inferior good. So here we have an individual's demand curve for clothing before and after their increase in income. Once they get that raise or get a new job, it's going to shift out to the right. And here's their demand for inferior, or the inferior good secondhand clothing. So the demand curve is going to shift from left because they're now making more income. They have more money on hand, so they don't need to buy secondhand clothes. All right. So the next is the changes in the price of related goods. And there's two types of goods here to talk about. The first is substitutes, and the second is complements. So substitutes are goods and services that can be used for the same purpose. So a Big Mac and a Whopper, they're substitutes. They're both fast food purposes. Ford F-150 and Dodge Ram, again, two trucks. Jeans and khakis, two different pairs of pants. They serve the same purpose. They do the same thing for you. And then complements are goods and services that are used together. So Big Macs and McDonald's fries, you purchase those and eat them together. Hot dogs and hot dog buns, again, together. Left shoes and right shoes is kind of weird because they don't sell shoes individually. All right. So what are the actual effects of a change in price of related goods? If there's an increase in the price of Big Macs, that's going to increase the demand for Whoppers. Because now it's relatively more expensive to buy a Big Mac, you have to give up more Whoppers, so people will demand more Whoppers. So again, you see a demand curve shifting to the right. So that's for substitutes. Now for complements, if you increase the price of a Big Mac, that's going to decrease the demand for McDonald's fries. Again, because these are always purchased together. Now that that Big Mac is more expensive, you're going to purchase fewer Big Macs. You're also going to purchase fewer McDonald's fries to go along with it. And if there was a decrease in the price of Big Macs, you're going to see the demand curve shift to the left for Whoppers because now it's relatively cheaper to buy a Big Mac. And you would see the demand curve shift to the right. It would increase for McDonald's fries if we had the price of a Big Mac decreasing. So there are a lot of goods and services that aren't perfect substitutes. They don't do all the same things, or they don't meet all the same needs, but they're pretty close. So for some reason, the textbook uses smartwatches as a product, as an example running throughout the book. So smartwatches aren't perfect substitutes for smartphones, but they do serve some of the same purposes. So many people already own the smartphone. Are they going to get enough of a benefit from the smartwatch to justify purchasing that as well? What do you guys think? Do you think smartwatches can be substitutes for smartphones? Are they more like complements, where they work together a lot? So if the price of smartwatches fell, what the price for smartphones fell, what do you think would happen to the demand curve for smartwatches? You think the demand would decrease? You think it would increase, right? Because they're complements. All right, next is change in tastes and preferences. So if a consumer tastes change, they may buy more or less of a product. So this is your sort of subjective value coming back into it. People like different things. Over time, their tastes change and their needs change. This can be affected by a lot of different things. It could be by advertising, could be social media, could be what their friends like. Maybe their friends discovered something new and convinced them to buy it. Maybe they saw it on a TV show, or maybe it became part of a meme and that was like free advertising for the company. You guys think memes can actually like change people's demand?
Yeah.
Can you think of like an example? Is there some?
Boyfriend.
The what?
White vans.
All right, any other ones?
Like the apple juice, that when you bite it, it makes the apple sound. Something. There was a video on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Let me see, I'll have to check that out. All right, so for an example, if consumers become more concerned about eating healthy, they might decrease their demand for fast food. They want to move to healthier options. So the demand curve for fast food is going to shift to the left. This is an example of a change in taste of preferences. Maybe they get a job and they have to now start dressing up more for work. That's going to be a change in their taste. So now they're going to demand less, say, like athleisure and more like professional clothing. So demand curve for athleisure is going to shift to the left. It'll decrease. Demand for like more formal clothing is going to increase. Next is changes in population and demographics. So demographics is the characteristics of a population with respect to like age, race, gender, all those sorts of things. Different characteristics that you can break it down by. Population in general is just like the number of people, so that's the number of potential consumers in the economy. So if the population increases, you've got more potential consumers, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. It's going to increase because there's just more people that can buy your stuff. Now for demographics, if demographics change, so let's say one demographic increases, and they typically buy a certain good, then you're going to see the demand curve shift to the right. And you're going to see more people demanding. So for instance, baby boomers are all getting old. They're retiring. So you'll see, because we have this large cohort, people born in what, those like decade and a half. Now that they're retiring, we'll see more like retirement homes. See that demand curve for retirement homes shift to the right. For most old people, like tapioca pudding, walkers, life alerts, all these shift to the right because there's just a larger group of consumers that would buy these goods. And finally, we have changes in expectations of future prices. So consumers don't just decide what products they want to buy, they also decide when they want to buy them. So future products, you can think of them as substitutes for current products because they'll fill the same need, but they'll be purchased later on. So if you expect that the price is going to increase tomorrow, you're more likely to buy today. So it'll increase the demand for that good or service today because you want to try to buy at the lowest possible price. Likewise, if you expect that there's going to be a decrease in the price tomorrow, demand is going to decrease today. If you know the price is going to drop, you'll just wait that extra day until the price drops and then purchase it. So if you find out the price of gas is going to go up tomorrow, you'll end up increasing your demand that day. You'll fill up today while it's still at the lower price instead of tomorrow. So what that's going to do is it's going to shift the demand curve to the right, increasing the demand for gasoline. All right, and now that we've talked about this, it's important to make sure we get our vocabulary right when we're trying to describe this. So the difference between a change in demand and a change in the quantity demanded. So remember, a change in the price of a product causes movement along the demand curve. So this is the initial demand curve. If we change the price from 450 to 400, we'll shift from point A to point B. So we'll move along the demand curve. That's a change in the quantity demanded. Now, a change in demand, that is a shift in demand curve. So we're shifting from D1 to D2 here. So that's any other non-price factor that's affecting your demand. So with the change in demand, as the curve shifts to the right, we're staying at $450 here. The price isn't changing, but something else is changing that's making the demand curve shift. So we go from point A to point C, we're still at the same price, but the quantity is increased from 3 to 5. Whereas your change in the quantity demanded, you're moving along the same demand curve. So you're going from 450 to 400. So the price is changing and the quantity is also changing. All right. You guys have any questions about demand? Anything you need me to explain again or something that wasn't clear? This is fairly straightforward, but it's important, like, we make sure you get the basics, so it makes it that much easier to build up as the class goes on. Because we'll be talking about supply and demand quite a bit. So there are a lot of similarities between supply and demand, about building the supply curve, the market supply, all that stuff. But there are some key differences. So in this section, we'll be looking at the market supply. So how firms decide how much of product to produce and to sell at the various different prices. And just like demand, supply isn't fixed, but it's determined by price. So right here, on the figure on the left, we have the supply schedule. So we have the price and the quantity of smartwatches that producers are willing to bring to the market at each price. So at $450, they're willing to supply a lot. They're willing to supply 7 million smartphones. Whereas at a price of only $250, they're only willing to supply 3 million smartwatches. So this is the exact opposite relationship that we had with the demand curve. Anyone hazard a guess why firms are going to be willing to supply more when the price is higher?
Make more money.
They can make more money. But also, remember, resources have all these alternate uses. So the parts that they're, and the raw materials that they're buying to make these smartwatches can be used for other things. So they have to bid them away and be willing to pay a little bit more than if they want to use those parts to, say, make a smartphone or to make, I don't know, a desktop computer. So they'll be willing to pay more. So because the cost of the raw materials are going to increase, they need to get a higher price, like actually back when they sell the good, in order to be willing to produce that many. And now we take those 5 points that we have on the supply schedule, and we can plot them on a graph, and then we have, between the price and the quantity, again, we can create our supply curve. So this is a visual representation of the supply schedule. So the quantity supplied is the amount of a good or service that a firm is willing and able to supply at a given price. So at $350, the quantity supplied is going to be 5 million smartwatches. And the law of supply, as you can see by the graph, is that if you hold everything else constant, so ceteris paribus, the increase in the price is going to increase the quantity supplied. And the decrease in price is going to decrease the quantity that's supplied. So this is a positive relationship. And remember, the price captures the opportunity cost of those resources. So they can be used, or if you can get a higher price for it, you'll be willing to pay more to get more of the raw materials. So you can think of each of these points as the minimum price that the firm requires to actually bring a good to the market. So in order to bring 4 million to the market, they'd have to get $300 back per smartwatch, or they're not going to produce that many. So just like demand, there's non-price factors that can affect the supply curve and then shift the entire thing. So a shift to the right is going to be an increase in supply. So that's moving from curve S1 to S3. And a shift to the left, so from S1 to S2, that's going to be a decrease in supply. Yeah, this is the same basic idea as demand. So when the supply curve shifts, again, this is just like for the demand curve, the quantity supplied is going to change even if the price doesn't. So if we're right here, so our initial supply curve at P1, we have an increase in supply, it's going to shift the curve to the right, the quantity is going to increase from Q1 to Q3, even when it's at the same price. And then the opposite happens, decrease in supply, you shift it to the left. And at that same price, you're going to demand, or producers will supply fewer smartwatches. Now, there's several factors that influence market supply. These are slightly different because it's the producer side of the market instead of the buyer side. So we have the prices of inputs, we have technological change, the prices of substitutes in production, the number of firms in the market, and the expected future prices. Right. So inputs are the resources we use in the production of a good or a service. So for smartwatches, it's things like the computer processor parts, the plastic that goes into it, and the labor. So the cost of actually paying workers to make these goods. So if you increase the price of an input, that's going to decrease the profitability of the good. Because your costs are increasing, you're not going to make as much money back. So this is going to cause a decrease in supply. Firms will be willing and able to bring less of a product to the market. On the other hand, if you decrease the price of this input, you'll end up increasing the profitability. You're lowering the cost, keeping the revenue the same. So we'll end up with an increase in supply. Firms will be more willing to bring more of a good to the market. So when you increase supply, you can shift the curve to the right. Next is a technological change. So firms can experience either positive or negative change in its ability to produce goods with the given quantity of inputs they have, so with their resources. This is what we refer to as a technological change. Typically, firms experience a positive change. They become more efficient. They get better technology to use. But sometimes they can have a negative change. Maybe it's a key worker leaving that knew a lot of information about the production process. Maybe they have machines break down, so they have to pull out an old one for a while. Another example, government restrictions on land use for agriculture may decrease the size of the wheat crop because they just have less land to use. So for that example, government restricts land, that's going to decrease the supply, so we're going to shift the supply curve to the left. So we'll move from curve S1 to S2. For the other example, a new, more productive variety of wheat, maybe it's a wheat that can withstand colder temperatures, so they can plant it a little bit earlier. Maybe it's, I don't know, the wheat part itself that we use, maybe that's bigger than previous wheat, whatever. If it's more productive, that's going to increase the supply of wheat. So we're shifting the supply curve to the right. Next is the prices of related goods in production. So firms can produce and sell a lot of alternate products. They have a lot of different choices of what they want to produce. So a farmer can produce either corn or soybeans. In this example, there's different crops that they can plant in their fields. So if the price of soybeans rise, he'll end up planting or supplying less corn. So the supply curve for corn is going to shift to the left. Again, because he can make more money making or growing soybeans. Other times products are produced together. So cattle provide both beef and leather. So if you increase the price of beef, that encourages more cattle farming. Again, because you're getting more money for each piece of beef. But what it's also going to do is increase the supply of leather, because leather comes from the same cows you're using to make those beef. So it's going to shift the supply curve to the right, increasing the supply of leather. So even though there was no change in the market for leather here, because there was a change in the market for beef, we end up getting more leather. This is the number of firms. So if there's more firms in the market offering a certain product, there's going to be more product available at any given price. So there's going to be a greater supply just because there's more firms out there making those goods. So it's going to shift the supply curve to the right if we have more firms enter the market. Now, if we have fewer firms, say a couple firms go bankrupt, they exit the market, the supply is going to decrease. So we'll shift the supply curve to the left. Now, if the firm anticipates that the price of the product is going to be higher in the future for some reason, maybe they've done market research, maybe they know there's going to be some change, but it hasn't happened yet. It might decrease its supply today. So they'll produce the goods, but they'll keep some on hand, waiting for the price to rise. Now it's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Again, because they know they can make more money if they save those for the future. They'll produce them and then wait a little bit and then put them on the market later when the price is higher. So just like the chain, or just like for demand, for supply, there's a difference between the change in supply versus the change in the quantity supplied. So a change in the price of the product that we're talking about causes a movement along the supply curve. That's the change in the quantity supplied. So we have this initial supply curve here. The change in the quantity supplied is moving from point A to point B. So we're moving from $400 to $450. But you're staying along that initial supply curve. So any of those other changes we talked about, those non-price changes, is going to cause a shift in the supply curve. So we'll move from curve S1 to S2, going out to the right. So we're still at $450 here, but we move from point B to point C. So the quantity has increased from 6 to 8. Remember, change in supply is a shift in the curve. A change in the quantity supplied is moving along that same curve. The only difference is the price. Okay, let's take a break here. We've been talking for a while. Open up to like a random question or statement or I don't know, debate. Something to give your minds a little rest so we can recharge and pay attention. They're dedicating like the economics program or something to a former professor. So they have like a ceremony after work today. Yeah. Thank you, I appreciate it.
So let's talk about online Fridays. What do you think?
That's interesting. I don't know if I can do that.
I'll say I don't know. You have time to do that.
I may. That's something to consider. I'm sure no one wants to wake up and be here at 9 a.m. on a Friday.
Like all my other classes are online.
So do you have a lot of classes that are doing like the kind of hybrid, like half the person?
Yeah.
Is it like half the class shows up one day, half the class shows up the next, or is it like some days are online, some days aren't?
I mean, most of them do online Fridays just to, I guess, people get less meeting time in the classroom. Overall, keep that down. But I mean, a couple classes are doing the hybrid stuff, and that gets people.
Yeah, I was supposed to do this hybrid, and they changed the room capacity Friday at like 3:30 before classes started. I don't know, if other people are doing that, that's something to consider. I'll let you guys know in the next couple of days. The one problem is like for online classes, you can't like ask questions. You just like watch it, and if you don't get it, like it's hard to like come back and ask later. Like I've taken online classes and haven't like, I've definitely learned more in class. But if that's only like a third of the classes, you can still get it kind of split up. But if I did that, I might have to do like some sort of like small quizzes about the lecture or something. You guys think, just to make sure that like, I don't know, you're watching.
Do live session.
Live session?
Yeah, do live.
Doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of getting to stay in bed?
You're not in bed.
Okay, so now let's put together supply and demand and talk about the market equilibrium. So equilibrium is a situation where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So we have a supply and demand curve both drawn, they're going to cross at that point. So they'll be exactly the same. So markets with many buyers and many sellers are what's called perfectly competitive. So a market equilibrium in one of these markets is going to be competitive market equilibrium because there's a lot of buyers, there's a lot of sellers. Price will move towards equilibrium. And the purpose of a market is to bring together buyers and sellers so that they can trade, so they can make themselves both better off. And make themselves better off through this trade, this mutually beneficial exchange, where both of them voluntarily entering these agreements, making themselves both better off. So, despite the fact that there's no central planner, that there's no one individual or one like group telling people what to buy, how much to make, what to price it. This is all individuals and firms deciding whether they want to buy at this price, whether they want to sell at this price, changing their willingness to buy based off changes in prices. Despite all this, it's not as chaotic as you imagine. It's actually pretty orderly. So it's a process. The market isn't just let people show up, buy goods, and then walk away. It's a process over time. Prices changing, the production method changing, prices changing, different goods now being offered, some goods not being offered anymore. Trying to meet consumer needs better and better, and trying to find products that meet their needs better and better. So equilibrium isn't permanent. It's not going to last for a long time. You don't just have the supply and demand curve cross each other, and then boom, market's equilibrium, we're all done. It's often going to change. So as exchange happens and this new knowledge is generated, what is the best way to produce a good, what price is going to get as many consumers to buy as possible while still making the firm as much money as possible. All this different knowledge as it's generated, the market's going to move in that direction. Maybe it gets knocked out of equilibrium for a little bit, and then over time it moves back towards equilibrium as we discover more knowledge. Adam Smith referred to this as the invisible hand, that markets act as if there's a planner, as if someone is watching over this, designing what to make and telling people how much to make. Called the invisible hand because there's no proof of this, there's no like actual evidence of this, but it appears as if buyers and sellers almost like working together, trying to determine what to buy, how much to buy, and all that. So obviously firms would always prefer to sell these goods at a higher price. They always want to make more money. But their self-interest forces them to sell at a lower price than what they would prefer. So that consumers would actually buy the good so they can maximize their profits. There's a good quote about how the market works, and that like all the sellers in the market are trying to screw consumers, but they have to screw them over as little as possible. And likewise for consumers. Obviously, we'd like to purchase things at the lowest possible price. But because we actually want these goods and firms aren't going to be willing to sell at such a low price where they're going to lose so much money, we have to be willing to purchase at a higher price in order to get the stuff we actually want and to maximize our own utility. So this pressure for consumers, forcing them to be willing to pay more, and firms, the pressure forcing them to sell at lower and lower prices, moves the market towards equilibrium. And while we don't know supply and demand curves in real time, there's no actual demand schedule or supply schedule like sitting there that we can look at. In real time, this process occurs as if firms and consumers know them, and we end up at equilibrium, despite the fact that no one in the market actually knows what these curves are. There are some positions for firms, like large manufacturers, that they just give you a ton of data on what the prices were, how many of the goods were sold over a long period of time, and your job is to try to estimate what the demand curve is for that good. They pay these people a lot of money because it's so difficult to try to understand and try to estimate what these demand curves actually are, especially in real time, that it takes a lot of money and not a lot of people can actually do it. So here we have an example of a market in equilibrium. So at a price of $350, This is the equilibrium price. Right there is where the supply and demand curves cross. So consumers are going to want to buy 5 million reams of paper, and producers also want to sell 5 million reams of paper at this price. So the equilibrium price in this market is $350, and the equilibrium quantity is 5 million. Oh yeah, I changed this from smartwatches to paper. I'll have to go through these slides and make sure I didn't miss any smartwatches like I did in this one. Because I thought it'd be funnier to use, to give me an opportunity to make some office references instead of just talking about smartwatches all the time. So since buyers and sellers want to trade the same quantity at the price of $350, we don't expect the prices to change here. Again, because firms are willing to supply as much as consumers are willing to purchase, there's no reason to move out of equilibrium at this point. Now, if something changes, something shifts either the supply or demand curve, then we'll move out of equilibrium. The market will have to adjust and move back towards it. But right now, once we hit this point, if the supply and demand curves don't change, we're not going to expect the price to change. So now, what happened if the price was 400 instead? Even though the equilibrium price is 350, if the firm decides to price it at $400. So what we're going to end up with here is a surplus. In this case, 2 million. So the quantity demanded is going to be 4 million, and the quantity supplied is going to be 6 million. So the difference between that is 2 million extra smartwatches. Because the price is $400, firms will be willing to produce more smartwatches because, because they're getting that extra revenue, they're willing to spend more money on resources that could be used for other stuff. However, at the price of $400, consumers only want to buy 4 million smartwatches. It's not worth it for a bunch of them. So we end up with too many smartwatches left over. We have 2 million in this case. So the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So what's going to happen is that sellers are going to compete amongst themselves to try to sell the smartwatches they have. They know there's too many of them, so they're going to drive the price down. They're going to start offering, $395, $375, $355, and settle at $350, so they can sell all the smartwatches that they produce. So as they decrease the price from $400 down to $350, more sellers are going to be willing to purchase. So instead of only 4 million originally, by the time they get the price down to $350, 5 million will be willing and able to purchase these smartwatches. So now what happens if the price is $250? So they price it too cheaply compared to the equilibrium price of $350. So at $250, consumers want to buy 7 million smartwatches. They want to buy a ton of them because they're so cheap, relatively compared to the equilibrium. But producers only want to sell 3 million. They want to sell a lot less because they can't get that much money back for it. It's more worth it for them to use those resources to produce other goods. So we end up with a shortage of 4 million smartwatches. Difference between the 7 million demanded and the 3 million being produced. So when there's a shortage, obviously the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So what's going to happen is that sellers realize they can increase their prices and still sell as many smartphones. So the price is going to rise. The price will rise all the way up to $350, at which point there's no reason to increase it or decrease it anymore because consumers are going to demand and they're going to purchase all the smartwatches being produced at that price. There's no reason for the firm to change. So when we're talking about the equilibrium, the price is determined by the interaction of buyers and sellers. So it's not just demand or not just supply, but it's both of those at the same time. So in a competitive market, so if there's a bunch of buyers and a bunch of sellers, which generally characterizes most markets, neither group, the buyers nor the sellers, can just dictate their price. So a firm can't just decide, I want to price it at this I don't know, too high of a price, and consumers just have to deal with it. If the firm does that, they're not going to sell many of the goods. So the product is going to be sitting there on the shelves. And eventually their self-interest is going to force them to lower their prices so that they can sell more of those goods and actually recoup the money. Likewise, buyers can't all band together and just refuse to buy at a price. To like, I don't know, force the company to lower their price in a competitive market when there's a lot of buyers and sellers. Because someone's going to defect and someone's going to purchase it if it's worth it for them to purchase it. Now, changes in supply and demand, so shifting the demand curves, are going to affect both the price and the quantity that's being traded in the market. So predictions about price and quantity in our model require us to use the supply and demand curves. And it requires us to know those if we're trying to use this model. So typically we know the price and the quantity, but we don't know the shape and most of the points on the curves that generate them. In real time, this is very difficult and practically impossible to figure out. Even though we don't know the exact supply and demand curves in the real world, we can still use this model to predict directional changes of increases in prices and quantities. So we may not know exactly the slope of the supply and demand curves. We might not know where they actually are. It could be just like tilted up like this at a different angle. It could actually be like a curve going like that. We don't know a lot of information about it besides basically just the equilibrium point. However, we can still gain some knowledge from this. So say we shift the supply curve to the right, we know the quantity is going to increase, we know the price will decrease. We may not be able to predict exactly what those changes are going to be. We can't say a shift in the supply curve is going to increase the quantity by 1 million and decrease the price by, I would say $25. But we will be able to say the price is going to decrease, quantity demanded will increase. So there's still some power to this model, even though we can't do exact predictions. I'm pretty sure this video is going to put us over time, so I guess we'll start there next week. Just exploring equilibrium and what a shift in the supply and demand curve actually means.